What happens when the person helping you to vote in an election doesn't agree with who you wanted to vote for? Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Blindseyepodcast, the podcast discussing everything you did and didn't want to know about being blind. My name is Connor, and this week, as the intro suggests, I'm going to be talking about voting and accessible voting in elections. I guess it's kind of a dry topic, but it's a hot button topic in the world at the moment because of things that we won't mention. But yeah, it's interesting because when it comes to having certain disabilities, or in my case, being blind, there are some interesting ways you have to approach voting, especially in Australia where we have to vote. And there are some barriers still to be knocked down or smoothed out. So I thought we would explore that a little bit. As usual, just my thoughts and experiences and the research I found. Definitely not speaking for everybody. I don't know if every single, jurisdiction in Australia works like this, but it's just what I've been able to find out or what I've experienced myself. And I don't know how it applies to the rest of the world, so please don't use me as an authority. It's just my chance to shine a little bit of light on some things people don't necessarily think about or may not have heard about. Okay, so when it comes to voting in Australia, as I said, it's compulsory. So we all have to vote in every level of election, whether it's federal, state, or local. And while some people don't like it, I guess it's kind of a good way of making sure we're all in it together. So if things go well, we're all in it together. If things go bad, well, we all have skin in the game, so it's all of our faults. So it's not just the fault of some people who voted or some people who didn't vote. We're all on the same ship, whether it's sinking or thriving, basically. So anyway, when it comes to voting accessibly when you're blind or have a vision issue, for example, you have some options. Some of them are better or worse than others, but it basically depends on what election you're engaging in. So the federal system has a slightly different method, the state systems have a slightly different method, and your local system will have a slightly different method. So it isn't just one across the board solution, especially if you're in, some disabled categories or hard to access categories. So, for example, in Australia, if you want to vote in the federal election, you have three methods of voting. You can vote in person, the standard, usual, normal way, the old school way. You can get a postal ballot, which, annoys Donald Trump, which gets sent to your home. And you can also call a phone line if you have access issues, either getting to a polling booth, or if you don't have somebody to help you fill in the ballot, or whatever your circumstances might be. Now, when it comes to state elections, you basically have all of those options, and in some states you have an extra one, which is a system called iVote, which is where you can vote online. Now, I'll be going into the pros and cons of each of the different methods in a second, but I just wanted to note that. And then when it comes to your local elections, the smaller time elections, as far as I can tell, it's usually either the postal vote or the old school way where you turn up. So, as I said, depending on the election, makes a difference on what avenues are open to you as somebody who might find the process a little bit difficult. Now, I guess you could say, well, why does that matter? You have these options, so what does it matter? That sounds like there's lots on offer. And there is, but there's a caveat to all of these things which needs to be explored and which always comes up around election time. So basically, the premise of the democratic system for everybody, and it's written into most constitutions and stuff like that, is that every citizen has the right to vote, and every citizen has a right to a secret vote, so you can't be intimidated or whatever to vote for another person. That's why you go into a little cubicle on your own. Nobody else watches you mark your paper, and you put it in the box yourself, and nobody opens that box unless all the candidates of the opponents in the area are around at the same time to make sure no shenanigans go on. Now, that's great, but here's where the trouble comes in, because, for example, with myself, I'm down to get a postal vote. So every election, I get a envelope that comes in the mail that has the ballot in it, and somebody is to help me fill that out. And on one hand, you say, great, cool, what's the problem, Connor? Well, the problem is that you might have somebody helping you who has very different political opinions to you, and they're the ones helping you mark the piece of paper. So an example of this was, I think it might have been my first or second election, and my mum was helping me fill out my ballot paper, and she was reading them out to me, and I said, yep, that one. And she said to me, you're voting for them? And while that might sound like a small thing, nobody else has that. So, we all get that when it leads up to elections. Oh, you like them, why do you like them, yada, yada, yada. But when it comes to the actual day of the vote, everybody else generally gets to walk into the booth, tick what they want without any eyes on them, discussing whether they should or they shouldn't. Whereas for me, in that case, I didn't have that. I had somebody questioning why you're voting for them. And they were the person actually helping me mark the paper in the right way. Now, luckily enough, my mum's a saint, and she would mark it the way I wanted her to. But again, it automatically showed that there was a little bit of a discrepancy here in my ability to be able to secretly vote like everybody else. But it also makes me think, what happens if there are other people who are asking somebody for assistance with that, who maybe are a bit more dubious? Because if my mum had very different political opinions to me, and she wasn't as an honest a person as she is, she could just tell me she ticked what I asked her to tick, and I wouldn't have known any better. She could have ticked something else, and then she says, okay, you need to sign your signature here, and then that gets sent in, and I know nothing more about it. So that's where the problem comes in, because you can never truly know, and it's based on the trust of the person assisting you, where it's not supposed to be based on trust. It's supposed to be based on individual secrecy, and that's how things get kept in check. Similarly, I believe you can do the same if you actually turn up to a polling station. Now, I've never done that, so I don't know how widespread this is, but from what I was able to find online on the Electoral Commission websites, it says that you can show up and somebody can assist you to mark out your paper. And again, on one hand, that's awesome. Somebody's helping you out. But on the other hand, there's a person between you and your fundamental democratic right to vote. And it's just that thing where, well, that doesn't happen for everybody else. So is there a better way to do it? And that's kind of the ongoing debate. The telephone use, if that's available in your election, is a bit better because I'm fairly sure it's automated, so you can do it yourself. You're just listening to particular numbers. But again, that adds a level of technology into it, and elections always get a little bit more hairy the more sophisticated the technology is involved, because it can compromise what's going on. Interestingly, though, with the telephone option, you can't just mark your name down as somebody who always wants to vote via telephone. So every time an election comes around, you need to basically apply to be able to vote via telephone. So there's an extra step in the process that you need to do every election, whereas somebody like everybody else can just say, okay, well, I know my postal ballot is going to come, or I know I just have to turn up to a local school and vote. And it's fairly well known across the world that the more small trivial barriers there are in the way of people being able to vote, the less voter turnout you get. And basically means the less democracy you get. Because if it comes down to somebody having to remember to do something and they don't remember, and then when the election comes around, they haven't started that process because it wasn't done automatically, then you're in a situation where you want to vote and you can't, or there isn't enough time. And then either you can't vote at all, which you can get fined for in Australia, or you have to use one of the other methods, which might not be secret. So that's where some of the inconsistencies come into play. Now, here in New South Wales, and I do believe some other states now, they rolled out a system in 2011 called iVote. And the way iVote worked was that you could apply to use it again, which is kind of an issue because you have to apply each election as it comes round. So again, a little bit of a troublesome thing where you should be able to just put your name down as, yeah, I will do this every election. But anyway, but you get given a voter ID, and that's specific to you and your name on the electoral roll. And then you register, they prove you are who you are, and then it opens up a website, and then you can make your selections on the website, and I can use my screen reading program to know what's what, and I can do it all in secret. So I can make my selections, and then what happens is they give you a receipt number and a telephone number to call, and you call that number, and an automated message on it will say, ask you for your receipt number, you'll punch it in, and then it will tell you, these are the preferences you made, are these correct? And then you press 1 to confirm or whatever. So then it's like a double, authentication thing to make sure that they know those are the choices you wanted to make, and that you're actually the person voting, and that it's not somebody else. And that works really well. But as I said, you need to enroll for that every single election that comes around. So if you forget about it, that can be trouble. So a perfect example of that was when I signed up to do it in 2011, I believed I had signed up to do it like that forevermore because it was great. But that didn't end up being the case. So then the next election that rolled around, I was waiting for something to come through, and it never did. So I basically had to then just do a postal vote, which then leaves me open to somebody questioning my vote. So because I was under the impression that it was just down as my default position now, I missed out on being able to vote in the way that I wanted to, which gave me the most independence and the most secrecy. And that's where troubles come in. And some people might say, well, that's small, insignificant, or, you should know these things ahead of time. But as I said, it's a very well-known phenomenon around the world that the more small, trivial barriers in the way of people voting, the less people tend to vote or get to vote because they've forgotten that one small thing that they were supposed to do, and then it's too late. And especially in a system that tells you you have to vote, it's kind of like, well, you can't tell me I have to vote and then also put extra barriers in my way to be able to vote. Also, it's just kind of similar with the mail-in and postal voting, because some people are under the impression they're down to be a general mail voter, it's called, which is you're down in the system that you will always get your ballot by mail. And they're under the impression that that's what they are. And then they're waiting for the ballot to come, and it doesn't come because they were down in the system as just needing that for a particular election. So they're under the impression that it's going to be like that forevermore, and then nothing comes, and either they miss out on their chance to vote or they can't vote, and then you can have issues with fines, but also just, you're not able to take part in the way you would like to, or you aren't able to take part in an independent, secret way. And so again, it's another one of those things that can be troublesome. And as I said, different methods and different trivialized barriers actually get in the way and they can change the outcomes of elections because they can skew certain ways. So, for example, they know pretty widely and pretty strongly throughout the world that certain demographics prefer to vote in a certain way because that's just the generation they grew up in. So, for example, when Australia did their last plebiscite on asking whether people were okay with gay marriage or not, the government, who didn't want it to go through, purposely made it to be a postal vote because usually the generations who use traditional mail are older generations, and the older generations are usually more conservative. So they were trying to make sure that they were giving the illusion that everybody was getting a say, but also hoping that all the young people would kind of forget to mail in their votes and wouldn't worry about it because they were used to other forms of media and other methods. So they were hoping that people in their 40s, 50s, 60s and above who are more likely to have more conservative-leaning views would be the ones who would actually flock in mass to participate, and then that would swing the outcome of the vote. Now, that's not what ended up happening, but it's quite well known that certain demographics, certain groups prefer certain methods over others when it comes to surveying or voting or whatever it might be, and that can skew the outcomes based on the differences going on there. And the last thing, I guess, is related to all of this, which I also find interesting, is that I tend to get contacted by people who are running for different seats or whatever in the area by letters in the mail that I can't read. So it automatically goes to, well, I'm being asked to give my vote to somebody and I can't even get the campaign materials in a way I can access. So how the hell do I even know what it is they're apparently wanting to do if they get elected? So, you can find yourself in a situation where you just know the party names. And look, for some people, the party is the party and they'll vote for them no matter what. But in other situations, you don't even know what the person stands for or what their dreams or ideas or whatever it might be for the area, because they're sending you envelopes, or they might only send emails if they're younger candidates or wanting to save on paper. And if you're an older person, you might not have an email address. Or if you're a blind person, you might not have access to technology that could read a piece of paper in an envelope. So, before you even get to the election, how the hell do you even know who to vote for? Particularly when some candidates will get more airtime than others for different reasons. So you may hear about some and may not hear about the others. And if you never hear about the others, how can you vote for them? So all of these things just kind of add up. And again, to some people, they might seem trivial, but they're all small little things that impact on how you can take part in democracy, which is supposed to be the fundamental base of our entire world or the Western world or whatever it might be. And it all plays a part in how you feel as a citizen, whether you can vote, how fair and free an election is, and all these things kind of come into play. And that's why it's a tricky situation, because on one hand you have technology, which has all of its possibilities, but technology can be hacked and undermined, and the old ways are less accessible and less secret for somebody like myself, but because they're so basic, it's much harder to be fraudulent in those elections and skew massive numbers of the votes, because it's just paper in boxes. And that's kind of where the battle is, because somebody like myself wants more technology, but that comes with the risk of the threat to the integrity of the vote itself, because the more people involved in the vote or the software or whatever it might be can change it. So anyway, I just thought that would be interesting to explore. It's a hot button issue at the moment in the world, but yeah, I hope that was interesting. Yeah, it was probably a little bit dry, but anyway, I hope that was interesting. You learned something you didn't know. As usual, you can get in touch with the show by emailing blindseyepodcast@gmail.com. That's BLINDSEYE podcast@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter if you search for @blindseyepod. And you can find the show on Facebook if you go for facebook.com/blindseyepodcast. And I will speak to you next week. Cheers.